So today we're going to talk about Pearl and why I'm perhaps worried about the direction that Pearl might go into in terms of a kind of meta for this map. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad map by any means. I'm not going to say that you're going to hate this map by any means. I think a lot of you will probably enjoy this map. But I am a bit worried about it in terms of the kind of the long term, what the meta might look like on this map. And I will explain that in good time. But first, we're actually going to go on to some other maps to try and understand some concepts using maps that you are all familiar with. And so first of all, let's talk about Split, and we're going to talk about attacking this B site. I'm sure many of you have struggled to attack this B site quite often, particularly if you are just going to 5-stack rush B. Because let's take a look at all the problems you're going to face if you do try and just 5-stack rush B. Okay, let's even assume you have B main control, which is already kind of, I'm giving you the first problem you might encounter with, but I'm just going to say you have B main control, right? And so we end up with this choke point here. And this choke point is quite narrow and it's quite long. And in general, that is going to favor the defending side. With narrow choke points, obviously mean any kind of mollies or raise nades or anything like that. Any defender's utility is going to bog you down in that choke point if it's very condensely packed. So that's going to be your first problem, is that, you know, this is a long and narrow choke point, right? But the second problem you're then going to have is if you do come out of this choke point, there could be people on your left and there can be people on your right, obviously. And I don't really need to explain why that is a problem. You can't look both ways at the same time. And then there's another problem as well, that on this right-hand side, there can be people at different elevations, right? So there can be people, and that's kind of true on the left-hand side as well, but less so because you know they're going to be close. But on this right-hand side, you know, they could be here on the floor, they could be here in hell, or they could be on the rafters as well. Even if you have the kind of normal smokes that go in towards heaven, they can still all be in these positions and see you, and they're all on different elevations, and that means that your crosshair placement can never actually be correct. And so that is just another problem that you're going to have, right? And then there is another problem as well, that if you continue to advance up onto the B site, there's nothing stopping a defender potentially from coming behind you as well, wrapping behind you and killing you from behind. So that's just an extra problem that you're going to have as well. And a way that, you know, a lot of pro teams even, and definitely in ranked games, that, you know, teams try and mitigate this is with just a sage wall across here, right? It mitigates having to check like close right. It mitigates some of these angles here on this right hand side overall, and it obviously stops the defenders wrapping around you from behind as well as you're trying to push towards the site. It does come with a slight disadvantage as well, in that you limit your own options, right? Now you can't come this way if you wanted to as well. If you wanted to get sneaky on them and try that, you know, you now can't do that either. And obviously it means for the defenders, they know that you have to come this way, right? So it's kind of a bit of a trade-off. And then on this B site as well, though, there kind of is a second choke point here. Not nearly as bad as the first one, but with the right defender's utility, it could cause you some problems. And as you come through it, again, you're going to have people on this left-hand side, you're going to have people on this right-hand side, and again, on this right-hand side, they can be on different elevations as well. And so again, your crosshair placement can never always be correct because you're just going to have to guess, essentially. And so that is just another problem. And then, you know, if you don't have heaven control and you have just 5-stack come towards B, there's only one place that you can actually plant safely, you know, and even then, if you don't have heaven control, you know, you can get raise nades or mollies bouncing off this wall that come to this plant spot. They will know that you're planting in that exact spot because that's the only safe place to plant. And so again, that is just another problem. And so that is why heaven control for this B site is so important and makes it so much easier, because if you get a sage wall towards this instead, it mitigates a lot of those problems, right? If you have this heaven control, all of a sudden it's the defenders who have a problem, right? It's if you're sending like 3 people here and 2 people here, all of a sudden all of these defenders in these areas, right? Now they have to look 2 ways. Now those are the ones looking 2 ways. Any defender close on this left-hand side, you'll see them. You'll have very good info. You'll probably have an advantaged fight because again, they're going to have to worry about this and you up in heaven as well, right? And then as you come further on, you know, maybe through the rafters here, towards this B site as well, that means that anyone back here now has a problem, right, of having to look 2 ways as well. So you could see that once you have heaven control and you're coming towards this B site, it mitigates so many of these different problems that you might have when you're actually coming on to this B site. But now let's come to Icebox to understand a map that is very easy for attackers to just walk up in onto the site. And on Icebox here, the reason is because it's kind of a choke pointless map, or at least towards B and A it is a choke pointless map, because these choke points are so big, and you know, you now are the team that can be on the different elevations as you come towards towards the site, you're now the team that is going on those different elevations, and these choke points are so big and wide that they essentially might as well not exist. They aren't choke points, really. It's kind of a choke pointless map when we're just going to B and A, and what that means is even at the highest levels of the game, even in the highest pro games, what you will see is it looks like a silver ranked lobby in terms of strategy, where a lot of it is just, yeah, let's 5-stack go A, let's 5-stack go B. Maybe someone lurks mid. That's kind of where Icebox is a meta, where it's just, yeah, 5-stack go a site, right? Because there isn't these choke points for defenders to be able to stop you from progressing onto the site, right? And so that's why Icebox is kind of very easy to get the spike down, and it kind of has become a map very much about just getting the spike down, or, you know, the defenders basically just trying to stop the spike being planted and then just playing for retake. So now let's take a look at Pearl then. Okay, what is Pearl doing as a map, right? What will be the meta on Pearl overall? Well, when we take a look at, let's start with the A site, for instance. Is it possible to just 5 group up, you know, and do this? Is that possible to just go through A main as a 5-stack? I do think it is possible, right? When we start analyzing this site, we see this choke point here, which I would say is neither wide nor narrow. It's kind of just in the middle. Like, I don't think it necessarily gives an advantage to either side. I think it's just kind of one that's in the middle. But one advantage that the attackers will have is that there is no close left, right? As they come in onto the site, they only have to check close right. There is no close left. That definitely is a great thing for the attackers to not have to do, because it means that as you come in, you can clear the right hand side. As you go deeper onto the site, you can then clear the left hand side and, you know, go one by one rather than having to worry about both sides at the same time. So there is a little advantage for the attackers there, and I do think that it will be possible for the attackers to just 5-stack go A and do okay. I'm not going to say that that's going to be like always a success, but I think it will go okay. But then, like, split, would going mid mitigate a lot of our problems that we might have coming onto this A site? Well, honestly, I think that not really, right? I think that this is going to be quite a challenge that honestly might not be worth the payoff. And let me explain. Let's say, again, we're going to send like the bulk of our attack, 3 or 4 players through mid here, and we're going to have 1 or 2 players coming towards A main. What would that look like instead? Well, these players in mid, they have to first deal with this pretty small kind of choke point in here, right? I'm not going to say that this is impossible to get through, but it will be difficult. You'll definitely have to use some utility to push off a defender from here, because this is a very little narrow choke point there. But once you have pushed them back, you then run into some other problems as well, which is there's kind of a second choke point here. And obviously, as you progress through this, you're obviously going to be worried about what's on your left hand side here, but there could be a nasty crossfire of, you know, as you're dealing with whatever is on your left hand side here, someone could swing from like the A side and come this side, and now you have a pretty nasty crossfire on you here towards this side of mid, right? So that is a little problem, but then again, without a Sage, how on earth do you cross across here without someone coming behind you there, right? That is going to be a big problem, that without a Sage, it's kind of impossible to stop the defenders doing that, because this is attached to their spawn. So it's going to be very difficult to stop the defenders from doing this at really any point in the round, right? So you're probably going to need a Sage here if you are going to do this, because this will be a very big problem for you if you are going to come to the A site. And then, kind of unlike Split, I would say, coming through mid doesn't give you like too many advantages either. You will have definitely a better attacking, you know, presence for anyone in here. Anyone on like this side of the site will be in trouble, right? If you're swinging this at the same time, for sure. But there are definitely some angles that defenders will play further back where you're not really gonna be able to impact them in any sort of way if you do come towards mid. Maybe you'll be able to surprise them in terms of you coming a bit being closer to them quicker than they expect, but other than that, you aren't going to get any free kills on anyone playing back here either. So overall, that's my thoughts on the A site, where I think stacking up as a 5 is possible to go to A, and that mid will have enough challenges where I don't think it will necessarily be like super viable to often send the thrust of your attack through mid, and I think honestly it might be easy to send like the majority of your players just through A main and just execute the site that way. But this A site, I think overall is fine, and I don't really have a problem with it. It's the B side of the map that we really need to talk about, because some of you may have noticed that this B site is a choke pointless site, right? Like potentially, maybe defenders, I think the barrier starts somewhere in there and the attacker's barrier starts somewhere in here. Maybe they can make this a choke point, but I think that would be very difficult and would require a lot of resources to try and make that the case. I'm sure it might work on some rounds, but I'm sure in a lot of others it won't. And so if you can't make that the choke point, which I think you won't most of the time, there is no choke point here that you can stop them from getting to the B site. Look at how open and wide this all is. Really, there is only one way to defend this at this point, and that is with probably a chamber up. And even then, that's kind of just more getting a kill and getting out and setting up for an advantageous retake, as opposed to holding down the entire site, right? I don't think that really it's going to be possible to stop people from just running it down here. And that obviously is kind of reminiscent of Icebox, but that isn't even really the biggest problem. That on its own is perhaps fine, you know, and you don't mind that. My real problem comes with this part of the map here, because this part of the map, I'm very worried, and this is my main concern, I'm very worried that this part of the map might as well not exist. Let me explain. So let's start off with this. This is a tiny choke point. A tiny choke point. You can only go through this door one by one. You can't go in as a big group of a team, and if you do, you're all going to die to some defender's utility for sure. This is perhaps one of the smallest choke points, if not the smallest choke point in the entire game. And it's going to be very difficult to cross. In fact, I don't even know really how you are going to reliably get past this choke point. But let's say by some miracle, you actually manage to do it, right? Let's say for whatever reason, you somehow manage to actually breach this choke point with multiple people. I highly doubt that will be the case without someone dying, but let's say you do it, right? And let's say you continue on your path down here. You then run into this narrow kind of long corridor. And this is kind of the second problem, that once you probably cross about this line, there kind of is no turning back. There is no, well, let's just rotate, right? Because you're going to have to cross back here, where again, the defenders could come here at any point, right? So there really isn't like a quick, like, oh, let's just go back very easily. That's not something that's going to really be super possible either. And so it's a very committal play as well coming down here. But then even if you do come all the way down here, you then have a second pretty narrow choke point to try and push through as well onto this B site, right? So you're having to push through a second narrow choke point. And again, you kind of can't go back. So that's another problem. And of course, at any point, again, if you don't have a Sage, what's stopping the defenders from just coming around the back of you at any point that you're running down here, right? There is nothing. Unless you Sage wall off, there is nothing stopping them from doing that. And so that could be very bad as well. So that's kind of my overall point, that you're going to have to somehow manage to breach this choke point. You're going to need a Sage there who I don't think is going to be able to help really in any meaningful way to help you breach this choke point. So it's going to be very difficult is my point. And when you look at this B site on the whole, your options are essentially go through this absolute gauntlet of hell to get to the B site, or just get there for free a lot of the time, as long as you have a sort of plan for how you're going to deal with an op. Obviously, in a lot of rounds, they won't have an op. So, you know, in those rounds, you don't even have to think about how you're going to deal with that. But that's basically your options. Take the easy free road, or take this absolute nightmarish, hellish road instead. And obviously, people are just going to pick the easy one, right? And so I think that this is my big concern, is that particularly on this B side of the map, the meta essentially is going to be always just do this, and this part of the map might as well not exist, right? Maybe someone lurks up there every so often, but other than that, it might as well not exist, right? And that people are just going to run it down B, and that this B site in particular is just going to be like, oh, Viper wall across here somewhere, you know, we're just going to play retake, everyone's just going to try and plant the spike there, come and play back here, and it's going to be super, super boring. That is really my worry about this B site, that is what it will look like. I think a good comparison for this part of the map would be on Icebox, and kind of similar to what it looks like here, right? How many times have you seen a team or your team do this in a game ever, where you come up towards kitchen, you come all the way across there and do this, right? Like, this is kind of the equivalent of doing that kind of split execute on Pearl on B site, because you have to come through a very narrow choke point, and then you have to run down a nice long corridor where, you know, it's very committal and you kind of can't turn back, and at any point someone could come behind you, and again you have to go through an exit, a very narrow corridor, right? Like, no one ever does this, and if they do, it tends to go really bad for them. So no one really does that, because your other option is just walk up on B and plant the spike for free a lot of the time, right? Like, those are your two options, and everyone always picks this. And that's why Icebox is kind of a broken map, right? Like, it doesn't really work as a map, because everyone just 5-stacks and goes A or goes B. This mid part of the map doesn't really even need to exist a lot of the time. In some games, it doesn't exist. And that is a big problem. And that's a failure of map design, right? And they tried to fix it and didn't manage it. And I'm just worried for Pearl that, particularly on this B side of the map, that the same might be true, right? Where we might get parts of the map that might as well not exist. And I think that that would be a bit of a shame. But I'd be very interested in hearing what you guys think. As I said, I'm not going to say that this is a bad map or anything like that. I'm sure I really might enjoy it, particularly as someone who plays a lot of Viper. I think I will enjoy Pearl quite a bit. But I am just worried about the kind of overall meta that it might be pretty boring, particularly on this B site.